A frozen forest in Nazi-occupied Poland. Midnight. Snow on the ground, no moon. Beneath a wooden hut inside a prisoner of war camp, a hole opens in the earth, barely wider than a man's shoulders. A gloved hand pushes through first. Then a head. Then a body, dragging itself out into the freezing dark, 30 feet beyond the camp's outer fence. He has just crawled through a tunnel more than 100 meters long, dug by hand, 30 feet underground, using bedboards for support beams, powdered milk tins for air pipes, and a system so ingenious the German guards patrolling directly above never heard a thing. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is the man who is not with him, the one who planned all of this, who is still back at the tunnel entrance, checking names off a list, sending his men out into the night one by one, knowing that for most of them, this will not end in freedom. It will end in a ditch, a forest, or a quiet room where a pistol is placed against the back of the neck. He knows this. And he goes anyway. This is the story of Roger Bushell, the RAF officer the Gestapo would come to fear more than almost any prisoner in Germany, and how he built and ran the largest, most audacious escape operation of the Second World War. They called him Big X. Before he was a legend, he was a lawyer. Roger Bushell was born in South Africa in 1910, educated in England, and trained as a barrister, sharp, articulate, ferociously competitive. He was also, by every account, one of the more reckless men to ever strap into a Spitfire. He raced cars. He skied at a professional level. He picked fights he had no business winning, and usually won them anyway. When war broke out, that same recklessness made him a natural fighter pilot, and it very nearly killed him almost immediately. On May 23, 1940, during the desperate air battles over Dunkirk, Bushell's Spitfire squadron was jumped by German fighters. His aircraft was shot to pieces. He crash-landed in France and was taken prisoner. For most men, that would be the war effectively over. Sit out the fight in a camp, wait for liberation, survive. Bushell had other plans. From the moment he was captured, he treated captivity as a battlefield of its own, one fought not with guns, but with tunnels, forged documents, and sheer bloody-minded persistence. He escaped almost immediately from his first camp. Caught. Escaped again. Caught again, and this time, it nearly cost him his life. He was recaptured after making it all the way to the Swiss border, and handed over to the Gestapo, who interrogated him personally. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that if he tried again, he would be shot. Most men would have taken the warning. Bushell filed it away as useful intelligence, and kept planning. By 1942, Bushell had been transferred to a new camp, Stalag Luft III, near the town of Sagan in what is now western Poland. It housed captured Allied airmen, and the Germans had built it specifically to stop men like him. Here's why it should have worked. The camp sat on land chosen for one reason: the soil was bright yellow sand, sitting just beneath a thin crust of grey topsoil. Any tunnel dug there would kick up sand that was impossible to hide. A single wheelbarrow of it dumped in the wrong place would give the whole game away. The huts were built on raised stilts, so guards could see clearly underneath them, no digging from inside a barracks undetected. Seismographic microphones were buried around the perimeter to detect tunneling vibrations. Guards nicknamed ferrets prowled the camp day and night, crawling under buildings, probing the ground with steel rods, watching for any sign of freshly disturbed earth. The Germans were so confident in this design that they believed escape was, for all practical purposes, impossible. Roger Bushell looked at all of this and decided the only sensible response was to build not one tunnel, but three, simultaneously, on a scale no one had ever attempted in the history of warfare. He gathered the senior escape officers in the camp and laid out the plan. This would not be 6 men slipping through a fence. This would be 200 men, walking out of a German prison camp in a single night, scattering across occupied Europe, and throwing German security services into chaos. They named the tunnels Tom, Dick, and Harry, deliberately mundane names, chosen so that if the words were overheard by a guard, they would sound like nothing at all. What Bushell built at Stalag Luft III wasn't just a tunnel. It was an underground industrial operation, staffed by 600 men, each with a specific job. The tunnels themselves were engineering feats. Dug 30 feet down, deep enough to defeat the seismic microphones. They were shored up with wood stripped from the prisoners' own bed frames. Entire bunks were quietly cannibalized, board by board, until men were sleeping on a fraction of the slats they'd started with, and nobody complained, because everybody knew what the wood was for. Air pumped through the tunnels via a hand-built ventilation system made from powdered milk tins, sewn together and hidden along the tunnel floor. A crude rail system, built from stolen and improvised parts, hauled trolleys of sand back through the tunnel on wooden tracks, because 600 men digging by hand needed a way to move dirt faster than buckets. And then there was the sand problem. Bright yellow subsoil dumped anywhere in a camp full of grey topsoil is a flashing red flag. So Bushell's men invented a solution that still sounds almost too clever to be real. They called them penguins. Prisoners would rig small bags of sand inside their trouser legs, tied at the ankle with string. As they walked around the exercise yard, they'd release a pin, letting the sand trickle out through their trousers and scatter across the ground with each step, then scuff it into the existing dirt with their boots. Over the length of the entire operation, over 100 tons of sand were dispersed this way, one hidden trickle at a time, right under the ferrets' noses. Bushell also built what amounted to a full forgery and production department. Prisoners with any artistic skill were put to work hand-copying German travel permits, identity documents, and rail passes, studied from documents smuggled in or glimpsed off guards. A tailoring unit converted RAF uniforms into civilian suits, German military coats, and railway workers' overalls, using dyed blankets and scavenged buttons. Men who spoke German fluently were trained specifically to pose as engineers or foreign laborers, coached on regional accents and cover stories good enough to survive a real conversation with a suspicious official. This was not a jailbreak. This was a shadow government operating underneath a prison camp, and Roger Bushell ran it like a general running a campaign, because that's exactly what he considered it to be. Along the way, the operation nearly collapsed more than once. Dick had to be abandoned when the Germans expanded the camp directly over its planned exit point. Tom was discovered by the ferrets and dynamited in front of the prisoners, a devastating blow, months of labor destroyed in an afternoon. That left Harry. By March 1944, Harry was finished, 336 feet long, 30 feet underground, complete with lighting rigged from stolen electrical wire tapped into the camp's own power supply. Bushell's ambition had always been 200 men in a single night. The reality, when the moment came, was far more fragile. On the night of March 24th, the first man dropped into the tunnel entrance, hidden beneath a stove in one of the huts. And almost immediately, the operation started to unravel. The tunnel had been aimed to come up just beyond the tree line, past the camp's perimeter fence, in cover of forest. When the final shaft was broken open that night, the exit came up short, dangerously short, in open ground, dangerously close to a guard tower, well short of the trees. Every escaper now had to time their exit between the sweeps of a German sentry's flashlight, then crawl on their stomachs through the snow to reach the tree line, one at a time. What should have taken minutes per man now took far longer. The carefully built schedule for 200 escapers collapsed under its own ambition. Men queued in the tunnel for hours. Fog rolled in, which helped mask the exit, and then an air raid forced the camp's electricity off, plunging the tunnel into total darkness for a stretch, halting the flow of escapers completely. By the time a German guard finally stumbled across the tunnel exit near dawn and raised the alarm, only 76 men had made it out. Bushell was one of them. Roger Bushell went out disguised as a French businessman, traveling with a Czech RAF officer, Bedřich Dvořák, posing as his interpreter. Forged papers in hand, fluent in French and German, Bushell had one of the strongest chances of any man that night of actually making it home. He nearly did. He and Dvořák made it by train all the way to Saarbrücken, on the French border, hundreds of kilometers from the camp, deep into occupied Germany, one connection away from real freedom. They were stopped at the station by the Gestapo during a routine document check. Something in their papers, or their manner, drew suspicion. They were arrested on the platform. Back at Stalag Luft III, the discovery of the escape had triggered something close to hysteria within the German command. 76 escaped prisoners, loose across the Reich, was treated as a direct affront to Hitler personally. Hitler, enraged, reportedly demanded that all recaptured officers be shot on the spot, a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention that even senior Nazi officials had to negotiate down. What they settled on was still a war crime. 50 of the recaptured officers, chosen individually, including Roger Bushell, were quietly taken from custody in small groups over the following weeks, driven out to remote locations under the pretense of stretching their legs, and shot by the Gestapo. Their deaths were then reported to the camp as men shot while attempting to escape, or resisting arrest, a lie the Germans knew the prisoners would see straight through, and didn't much care. Roger Bushell was murdered on March 29, 1944, 5 days after walking out of that tunnel. He was 33 years old. Of the 76 men who escaped that night, only 3 made it all the way home to freedom, 2 Norwegians and 1 Dutchman, who used contacts, boats, and sheer nerve to reach neutral territory. 23 were recaptured and survived the war in captivity. 50 were murdered on Hitler's direct order. Here is the part that's easy to miss if you only remember The Great Escape as a thrilling story of tunnels and disguises. As a pure escape, judged only by the number of men who reached freedom, it was, by any cold measure, a failure. 3 out of 76. So why does this story still matter, 80 years later? Because Roger Bushell never actually believed most of his men would make it home, and he ran the operation anyway, for a reason that had almost nothing to do with individual escape at all. Bushell understood something about total war that went beyond his own camp. Every escaped prisoner loose in occupied Europe forced the Germans to divert enormous resources to hunt them down, police, Gestapo units, checkpoints, manpower that could not be used elsewhere. A mass breakout of 200 men, he calculated, wouldn't just be an embarrassment to the WWII. It would tie down thousands of German personnel for weeks, at a moment when every soldier, every hour, and every resource mattered to a regime fighting a collapsing war on multiple fronts. In that sense, the Great Escape wasn't primarily about 76 men getting home. It was a deliberate act of sabotage against the German war machine, using nothing but wood, wire, forged paper, and the courage of 600 prisoners who built an escape route most of them knew they'd never personally use. And it worked. The manhunt that followed genuinely did consume enormous German resources across multiple countries for weeks. The murder of the 50 escapers, meanwhile, backfired on the Nazis in a different way. When the killings became known, first rumored within POW camps, later confirmed after the war, they were treated internationally as exactly what they were, a war crime. After Germany's surrender, Allied investigators launched a dedicated manhunt of their own, tracking down the Gestapo officers responsible for the murders. Most were identified, tried, and executed or imprisoned for their role in what became known as the Stalag Luft III murders. Roger Bushell's death was investigated, and to some degree, avenged. The story might have remained a footnote of military history if not for a book written a decade later by Paul Brickhill, an Australian former POW who had actually been part of the escape organization himself, though barred from going through the tunnel that night due to claustrophobia. His account became the basis for the 1963 film that made this story famous around the world, cementing images of motorcycle chases and defiant prisoners in the popular imagination forever. Some of that film is Hollywood invention. There was no motorcycle jump over the Swiss border fence. But the core of it, the scale of the tunnels, the forgery operation, the penguins scattering sand, the murder of 50 men on Hitler's order, all of that really happened, engineered by a barrister-turned-fighter pilot who refused to accept that a cage built by the Third Reich was actually inescapable. Roger Bushell never saw the war end. He never knew that the operation he built would become one of the most studied acts of defiance in the history of captivity, or that his name would still be spoken with respect 8 decades later. What he did know, in the final days of his life, was this: he had built something extraordinary out of nothing but sand, wood, and desperation, and for one cold night in March 1944, he had made Nazi Germany afraid of what unarmed prisoners could do. Of 600 men who worked on those tunnels, only 76 ever got the chance to use them. Only 3 made it home. But every single one of them, the diggers, the forgers, the tailors, the penguins scattering sand in the exercise yard, and the man who planned it all, struck a blow against a regime that believed no prisoner could ever truly be free. Roger Bushell paid for that defiance with his life. He would have called it a fair trade.